welcome to another live stream on History Right Podcast. Tonight, I'm joined by Gary Greenberg, and we're going to be discussing his book titled The Case for a Proto-Gospel, Recovering the Common Written Source Behind Mark and John. I have the link to purchase the book in the description below, so you want to go get yourself a copy. Do it for that link. It's an affiliate link, so I also get a small contribution if you use that link. So thanks in advance. Well, Gary, it's good to have you back on the show. Thank you for joining me once again.
Good to be here. Having some dermatology work done, so don't let it frighten away the listeners.
So let's do a little recap for those that don't know about your work on the Proto-Gospel, haven't seen your previous podcast episodes on this channel or elsewhere in which you've discussed the Alpha Gospel. What is the Alpha Gospel? What is the idea of it? What's it all about?
Okay, the theory is that almost the entire biography of Jesus as an adult, excluding the speeches, was written down prior to the four Gospels. And it's the primary source for what's in all four Gospels as the source stories. I mean, a couple of other things have been added here and there by the Gospel authors, but basically the adult life of Jesus was written in this earlier book. Mark knew this Gospel, and in addition to some other sources, he knew this one, and it makes the major part of his Gospel. He adopted it, although he made some changes here and there. Luke also knew the Gospel, but knew Mark too, so he was dealing with two sources that in many ways were similar, but which had differences. John, and this is the key here, John also knew this Gospel and hated it. He didn't like this proto-gospel, which is basically saying he didn't like Mark. And the impetus for him writing his own gospel was to refute this particular gospel with a different version of Jesus' story based on his own theology. He had significant reasons from his own perspective for really disliking the proto-gospel, or what I call the Alpha Gospel. So that's the background. The question is, showing it, proving it, demonstrating it, and so on.
What is the relationship between what you're talking about and the synoptic problem?
And the anti-synoptic problem?
And the synoptic problem.
And the synoptic problem. Yeah, well, that's a big problem that I see with the way they handle some of the gospel studies. The synoptic problem is the problem of dealing with the fact that there are so many stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that have so many of the same details, very frequently the same language, that they look alike in many ways, although there's a lot of places where they depart and vary in sequences and other things. And so the idea is there must have been a source of some sort for at least two of the three Gospels, if not all three. And the question is, who might have been first, and was he used as a source for the others? And the general theory, almost universal among New Testament scholars who do this sort of work, is that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke both knew Mark and significantly used Mark as a source, although occasionally choosing to alter his stories, move them around, change things around. But enough is left so that you know that it's very likely they were copying from Mark. Implicit in that is that Mark wasn't thought of as scripture, merely as a source, because if he was scripture, they wouldn't have altered it. So then the problem then is scholars only work from the alignment of stories that agree with each other visually and orally. Do they have the same story? Do they have the same statements, the same verbiage, and so on? They don't come at it from the perspective of saying, well, what would it look like for someone who knew the material in Mark, Luke, and Matthew, but didn't like it and wanted to do something different, had a different viewpoint, and wanted to change it? And that's where the concept comes from in my approach. I work from the idea that John had a very distinctive theology. He didn't like a lot of the stuff and you can see that he doesn't like a lot of the stuff based on what he says in his theological statements or other areas, that he doesn't like a lot of what he sees in the Synoptic Gospels. So then the question becomes, can you say that John knows the Synoptic Gospels, or at least the source for the Synoptic Gospels, or any of the Synoptic Gospels? And how do you show that? And that's what my book is about, how you show that.
What are some of the examples of Mark and John having similar material, but you see it coming from the Alpha Gospel?
Okay, well, you have you have the bread miracle, Mark's first bread miracle. John has that miracle. Mark follows it up by having the apostles go up on a mountain and then sailing across the water. John has the apostles go up on the mountain and then sail across the water. But then there's a break. In Mark, they're supposed to be going to Bethsaida, and there's a storm and allegedly blows them off course. They don't get to Bethsaida until after Mark's second bread story. So there's a big jump from Mark 6 to Mark 8 before you arrive at the destination that should have been in Mark 6. John pretty much goes straight there and bypasses all the material that is between Mark's bread, crossing of the sea and the end of his next bread miracle. John has a story about the healing of the paralytic that Mark has, but there are so many differences, it becomes controversial among scholars as to whether John is even telling the same story or knows a similar source. The same thing with healing a blind person. John's story has so many variations, yet there are shared points in the story, so that, again, scholars argue over whether or not John knew a similar source or not. John has, a number of stories. He has, those are some of the highlights, but there's so many. His paralytic story, the big problem, among others, is that he places it on a Sabbath. And Mark does not place it on a Sabbath. And scholars say, why is he putting it on the Sabbath? I don't understand this. How could he put it on the Sabbath? What's the point of that? And it's because they haven't understood what John is doing there. John has parallels to Mark's Sabbath stories embedded in his story, but the facts look different. In Mark, there are two hostile Sabbath stories. One involves the apostles walking through a grain field, picking grain and eating on the Sabbath, a violation. And the authorities are really upset about that and want to know why the apostles are doing this. And Mark has a pretty ludicrous story about Jesus's defense. Then there's a second story right after it about a hostile confrontation between Jesus and the Sabbath, where they want to. It ends in a very hostile confrontation when he heals in the Sabbath in Mark. So what John has done is he doesn't want to, the healing in Mark is an exorcism. So one of the first things you have to know about John is he doesn't like exorcisms. There are no exorcisms in John. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that other people can do an exorcism besides Jesus. It was practice thought to be, priests could do it and others. Luke specifically mentions that in his own gospel. So John is opposed to any form of proof that depends on an exorcism. He wants whatever Jesus does to be unique. So in his gospel, he uses the paralytic as the person who's healed, and rather than the exorcism story that's in Mark. And he tells the man after he's healed to pick up his mat and walk, which would be a violation of the Sabbath. So basically, John has two events that parallel Mark's two events: the unauthorized authorizing activity on the Sabbath and healing on the Sabbath. But those two Mark stories are very, very close to the healing of the paralytic. So John has edited the three together in a different montage that addresses the three stories. But Mark's stories have problems that upset John. In the healing, we have the exorcism, but it's being offered as proof that Jesus has authority to heal from God. But that leaves open the possibility that there are other things Jesus doesn't have the authority to do. And so John eliminates that issue. He's combining everything into one story and says in his story that he's been given the authority by God, by the Father, to judge. He has the authority to judge given from the Father, and that's why he can forgive sin and do whatever else he does. There are no possibilities that he doesn't have judgment. Mark leaves lots of possibilities that there are things he doesn't know. In the second Sabbath story, Mark has Jesus saying, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Again, it's a single incident, leaving possibility that other things can be done. John has incorporated it all into his one universal Sabbath story, showing that Jesus has the authority from God to enter judgment. And it applies to everything, not just isolated incidents. So that's what John is doing in that story. And that's an example of how John starts to approach things that he doesn't like. Another thing that's missing in John are parables. And why is he missing parables? Again, in my opinion, in Mark, the apostles ask Jesus why he tells these complicated stories, the parables. They're so hard to understand. And Mark's Jesus says, "Oh, well, I'm not giving this to the public. This is for you. These are special teachings for you." Well, John doesn't like that. His gospel is very simple, nothing hidden. He wants the story, his gospel, to be easily understood, and his gospel is very simple. If you want to be saved, you have to believe that Jesus was sent by the Father to bring eternal life. And he repeats that over and over and over. It's a simple gospel, and anything that gets in the way of that teaching, he rejects. And so he will rewrite any story that has any other way to get saved. And there are stories where that happens.
How does the Gospel of Luke connect to the Alpha Gospel? What is Luke's involvement in this situation?
Well, we know that, and I have a fairly extended list that a lot of people haven't gotten to, but a number of scholars recognize that there's a very large number of stories in Luke that have elements in John, many of which don't appear in Mark. So there has to be an explanation for where Luke is getting material that looks like John, but isn't coming from Mark. And there are a lot of incidents, and I have a very long list in my book of places where that happens. Just a few samples, like when Jesus is before Pilate. Pilate twice declares Jesus innocent in both Luke and John, but never in Mark. Luke and John say the cock crowed 3 times. Mark says twice. And if you go throughout the gospel, there are a lot of places. John has a story about Mary Magdalene going to the, that's not the one I want. He has the dinner with Mary and Martha. Luke and John have the dinner with Mary and Martha. Mark does not have that dinner, but John has that dinner combined with the dinner at Bethsaida in the last week of Jesus's life. Luke moves it much earlier into the gospel. So there are a lot of places where you can find story. John and Luke both have a story about Peter miraculously catching a huge, heavy load of fish, missing in Mark. But John and Luke have them in very different places in the gospel. You can find lots of these kind of stories and incidents throughout both gospels. So the question now becomes, is there a relationship between Luke and John, or is there a third source that both are using? Did John know Luke? Did Luke know John? Or do they both know this third source? And I spent some time in there going over the reasons why John didn't know Luke and why Luke didn't know John. So that the Alpha Gospel would have had to have been the reason. You also find several places, which is kind of interesting to me, where Luke knows Mark, obviously, and follows Mark fairly succinctly and consistently in many places, yet has a number of places where he disagrees with Mark and identifies with a story of John. There are a number of places where Luke varies from Mark in a way that agrees with John. That's a rather strange thing. For example, in Mark, at the story of the hometown rejection, Mark talks about Jesus's mother and brothers, and Mark never mentions the father of Jesus throughout his gospel. Luke and John both twice at approximately the same point in each gospel mention Jesus's father but not the mother. Once early in the beginning, just as Jesus is setting out, Luke and John both talk about Jesus being the son of Joseph. And then in that same story where Mark uses the mother and children and brothers and sisters, John and Luke both refer to the father and not the mother and the brothers and sisters. That's very strange. Where does that come from? In one of the stories where you have where they bring the paralytic to Jesus to be healed, Mark very specifically says it's in Galilee at the home of Jesus. In John's variation of the same story, which is I've mentioned previously, he places the story in Jerusalem. So one would expect that if Luke is closely following Mark's story, which he generally does, he would place it in the same place Mark does. But he doesn't. He has a very ambiguous location, and he talks about Pharisees from all over the country gathering together. Where would that happen? Where would the Pharisees be gathering together all over the country? He doesn't say, but it's most likely Jerusalem. So Luke appears to have been caught between a source saying the story happened in Jerusalem and Mark's story saying it happened in Capernaum in Galilee. And he chose to fudge the story by making it an ambiguous location. So you see a lot of stuff like that happening.
So does John use Mark and Luke at all, or is he totally independent of Mark and
Totally independent of Mark and Luke. He's working from the Alpha Gospel, and there are reasons why one has to make that judgment based on what's missing, what John has that's missing in the others, and so forth. But the point is that Mark has copied so much, so closely from the Alpha Gospel, despite making some changes, that John functions as a critique of Mark. For all practical purposes, John is an attack on Mark's gospel, even though he's attacking Mark's source rather than Mark. And similarly with Luke and implicitly with Matthew, to the extent that Matthew follows Mark. John has a very different approach to the story of Jesus from the three synoptic versions.
Given that Mark mentions Mary, the mother of Jesus, but not Joseph, and given that John mentions Joseph but not Mary, would the Alpha Gospel have mentioned Joseph?
Yes, that's the point. When you get an agreement with John and Luke against Mark, that's a clue that we're dealing with the Alpha Gospel. Why would Luke have this agreement with John against Mark unless he either knows John or John knows Luke, or the two of them know this third source? And so, obviously John is not getting it from Mark, that's for certain, because Mark doesn't mention it. And the two of them Luke and John have the story in the same approximate locations narratively, both at the beginning of the mission and in the rejection story. These are two stories separated by a wide distance in the Gospels. And their versions are very, very different. So while they have similar phraseology, they're telling two very different stories in both cases. So that suggests that the one isn't using the other.
So now I'd like to ask you about the Lazarus story we see in Luke, and also a different kind in John. What are the connections there between Luke and John, and how does the Gospel of Mark figure into that?
Well, there's a lot of interesting overlay that I think a lot of scholars have missed or don't pay enough attention to. John's story about Lazarus is very odd. He has Lazarus coming out of a cave, wrapped in bandages and so forth, mask across his face, and so forth. And when you look in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, I think it is, Deuteronomy or Leviticus, and they describe the procedure for a leper. He's supposed to be kept away from the community, bandaged, coverings over his face. So we start with John's Lazarus coming out of that cave in an isolated location, looking very much like he's actually a leper. Mark actually has a story about John healing a leper very early in his gospel. In Mark's story about healing the leper, he says that Jesus had to leave the vicinity for fear because there was hostility to him over it. In John's gospel, we're told that Jesus had to leave the vicinity because of fear as to his dealing with the healing of the leper. So that's a very odd parallel. Then you go to shortly thereafter, and you're in the house in Mark of Simon the leper, and in John in the house of Simon, where the healed leper is present. Lazarus is present. This is the same dinner for both, the same occasion in both Gospels, just before Jesus is doing the last week of his life. And so you have a home of a leper, Lazarus in the home of the leper. Why is Jesus in a home of a leper to begin with? And why do we have the parallels of Jesus having been chased out of the neighborhood by healing the leper? John, I think, has used Mark's version of the leper story from the Alpha Gospel and turned it into the healing of Lazarus and made it the miracle of miracles, something that nobody had ever been able to do, which was to bring somebody back to life. No exorcisms here. This is bringing someone back to life. That's not an exorcism. John doesn't depend on exorcisms. And wherever possible, his stories eliminate anyone who comes to him because of exorcisms. So I think that's what happened here. I think John has adapted the leper story and made it the bringing someone back to life. And he's got all the trappings of the leper story in it. The Alpha Gospel probably had the original trappings, and Mark left them out because Mark tends to shorten every one of his stories as much as possible, have as few details as possible. Most of his stories are only a couple of lines each.
Are there differences in the triumphal entry? Do they also apply to the Alpha Gospel?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the triumphal entry, partly due to the fact that John has rearranged a lot of stories pursuant to his explanation of why the priest or the council wanted to put Jesus to death, which is very different from the synoptic version. Raymond Brown, the prominent Johannine scholar, has gone as far as saying that he's pretty sure John had a different passion narrative than the one used by the synoptics. But in any event, there was a major chronological change in John, and almost all of whatever he does, that was part of almost everything that he has that was part of the synoptic passion narrative in Jerusalem was moved prior to his arrest, was moved out of the chronological pattern. So in John, he has a last visit to Jerusalem that comes several months before Mark's last week in Jerusalem. And after the Lazarus story, John goes into hiding in the last week, while Mark has Jesus going into the temple in the last week. So John places the triumphal entry after his whole long story of Jesus in Jerusalem, which takes several chapters of John. Mark has, and the other synoptics have the triumphal entry in the beginning of the arrival in Jerusalem. And interestingly, while John has Jesus riding Jesus on a donkey, he doesn't have the donkey riding to the Jerusalem and entering Jerusalem. He never enters Jerusalem during the triumphal entry. Only in the synoptics does Jesus go into Jerusalem after the triumphal entry. And there are elements in the triumphal entry story that John shares with Luke a little bit. Luke and John both have Pharisees and others complaining to Jesus about what's going on. They both have allegations that they were accused of blindness, not seeing what was going on. So you have some of that. And then there are some other elements that are a little too complicated to talk about, but John's story is very long. John also has moved a portion of Jesus's crucifixion story into his triumphal entry story. More specifically, in the Synoptic Gospels, after the Last Supper, they move out of the dinner and they assemble elsewhere, and Jesus starts praying and saying, "If you can take this cup away from me, please, but if it's your will that it stays with me, then that's your will and I will follow it." Basically, he's saying, if you can let me not die, that would be good. But if you want me to die, I'm okay with doing it. That's the synoptic version. In John, he takes the cup story and says, should I reject this cup that has been given to me? No, I shall take it. Because in John, he works with Jesus knowing that God has a specific plan for what should happen. And the plan is that Jesus shall be put to death, and then he will come out of the tomb and raise and be resurrected. And it's the plan that differs from the Synoptic Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, priests want to kill Jesus because they're jealous of his authority and want to get rid of the competition. In John, the reason they want to kill Jesus is that God planted a prophecy in Caiaphas's head, into his brain, telling him that people can be saved by the death of Jesus, and otherwise Rome will destroy Israel and the temple. But you can avoid that by having Jesus put to death. So it's God's plan. He wants the priests to put Jesus to death. And he tells Caiaphas to do that. And that's the only reason they chose to put Jesus to death. There's no jealousy. There's no fear of popularity in that sense. Only what the prophecy from God told them to do. So you have this very significant difference. John's Jesus knows the full plan, and that's why at the end of the crucifixion, he says, "It is finished," because the plan has now come to fruition. He's going to be resurrected after he dies.
And what about what the Gospel of John says about Judas Iscariot? And my second part of that question is, both Luke and John talk about how Satan entered into Judas.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Right. You have that in both Gospels, which probably was original to the Alpha Gospel. Mark removed that because he just wanted to show Judas as a betrayer. The element of Satan entering into Jesus significantly undermines the idea that Judas betrayed Jesus, but the story is much, much more complicated. I've written separately that in the beginning of after the death of Jesus, Judas was not thought of as a betrayer and remained part of the 12. It was only later on that the idea was that he was a betrayer. In fact, as I argue in one of my other books, that Judas was representing Jesus in discussions with the high priest and Pilate. He was Jesus's representative. There's a lot of clues and reasons to believe that, but I don't want to get into that here and now and go into diversions. So you have the starting point of Judas being corrupted by a evil spirit and had no control over what he did. Spirits do that. That's part of the story from the Alpha Gospel to lead to the death of Jesus. But then there's also the Last Supper issue. And again, John has a fairly different take on it. And the Last Supper basically, the word for betrayal is doesn't mean betray. In the gospel is not the word for betrayal, it's for the word hand over. In the Last Supper, Jesus says, "I'm handing over this bread to one of you." And In the Synoptic Gospels, it's taken as a sign that Jesus is going to betray Jesus, and it's language to that effect. Interestingly, in John, Jesus says to Judas, "It's time for you to go and do what you're going to do." And the apostles, despite what John said about handing over the bread, have no sense that Judas is supposed to go betray Jesus. They don't see Judas as going to betray Jesus. They thought he was just going on an errand for Jesus. That's a very, very odd kind of passage. The one passage where John goes bad on Judas, comes from the anointing in Bethany story, because Judas is the one who calls out Jesus for betraying the poor by allowing the use of expensive oils to anoint him. And in all the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus defends himself on that by pointing out that it's necessary for a good thing, because he's going to die and this is for his funeral and they're preparing him for a burial, although the story doesn't make sense in that context. But in John, Judas calls Jesus out. In the Synoptics, it's the apostles as a group that call him out. In John, it's only Judas. And Judas denounces Jesus for allowing money to be spent for expensive perfume or oil when it could have been spent for helping the poor. So we know the stories in all the Gospels, and John is looking for a way to defend Jesus, the perfect man, against this attack. And so what he does is he says, well, Judas didn't really mean that. Judas was just upset because he was the treasurer and he wanted to siphon off some money for himself. Not take the bribes, just siphon off some money for himself. And so that's his attack on Judas. But that was done to protect Jesus against a very good argument that was being made by the apostles, that expensive money could have been used to feed the poor instead of buying very expensive oil.
So now I would like to shift to when the guards mock Jesus and strike him.
Yeah, John has a very, very different version of that story. In the Synoptics, the striking of Jesus is a big deal by the guards. In John, he changes it around radically. In John, he's brought to the house of the chief priest or the co-chief priest. There's a lot of confusion in Luke and John about who the chief priest is. In any event, putting that aside, John is with the high priest. Jesus is with the high priest. And the high priest asks him a question about what his teachings are. And Jesus makes an insulting comment towards the high priest about, you should know what I've been teaching. And one guard slaps Jesus on the face for being rude to the high priest. No mockery, just a slap, and there's no mockery by the guards against Jesus in John's gospel. As a matter of fact, he even eliminates the mockery at the cross too, in an interesting way, which I'll explain if we get to that.
Well, why don't you go ahead and explain that?
Okay. John has an interesting passage. There are no mockeries at the cross, but Pilate nails an inscription in 3 languages onto the cross, accusing Jesus of being the Son of God, the King of the Jews. And in the Synoptic Gospels, that's the accusation against Jesus. And at the cross, there's 3 mockeries about Jesus being the being the King of the Jews. Say, hey, come on down from the cross, or hey, defend yourself, or hey, this or that. In John, the 3 inscriptions replace the 3 mockeries. Each is implicit a mockery of Jesus by Pilate, not by the Jews. But you have each language, the 3 different languages are the mockeries, and it comes from Pilate, not from the Jews at the cross.
What about the Eucharist? I know you talk about that in the Gospel of John. It seems to have like 2 versions of the Eucharist story, one different from the other.
Yes.
And Mark and Luke have their own, obviously, and there's a relationship there with the Alpha Gospel.
Yes, it's a very, very important story, not only because John has what I believe to be the original Eucharist story and explains a number of problems with Paul's version of the Eucharist, but because I believe it preceded Paul, it makes this Eucharist story and the Alpha Gospel very likely pre-Pauline, moving the story very close, the Alpha Gospel, very close in time to the death of Jesus. But let's go into the 2 different Eucharist versions. We start with a real problem in Paul. Paul says he has a teaching about the Eucharist. And he says he didn't get it from anybody. It was revealed to him by God. And this is what is supposed to have happened at the Last Supper. But if it happened at the Last Supper, how could the apostles have not known what Jesus said that Paul is revealing? And Paul has had relationships with the apostles prior to these things. So something is already off kilter. Now, when you look at Luke, no, first you look at Mark. And Mark has a story about the Eucharist, about drinking the wine and eating the bread. And his story is approximately similar to a part of Paul's teaching. So it's very likely Mark doesn't know the written version of what Paul said, doesn't know exactly what Paul said, but has a sense of what Paul's teaching was on that. Luke, on the other hand, has a mixture of what Mark says and what Paul says. And in fact, the part of his gospel, of his Eucharist story, that copies Paul is virtually verbatim exactly what Paul wrote in his letter. So you have this very, very serious duplication in Luke's gospel of a portion of Paul's letter And it seems unlikely that he could have done that unless he had access to Paul's letter, or at least a copy of Paul's letter. And so he's taken what was said by Paul and what was said by Mark and integrated them into a much slightly longer Eucharist story than what Paul says. Now we go to John. John moves the Eucharist story out of the Last Supper and replaces it with a different story. And he has a very specific reason for doing that. In the story of the rejection of Jesus at Capernaum, the story is heavily disguised in the Gospels, and I reconstruct it from what's being said. And this is a very serious story. As a matter of fact, in the Q source, there's a curse placed on Capernaum for what they did in rejecting Jesus. Although it doesn't specifically represent this story, this is the only story that would be applicable. And in it, he heals, or he claims he's going to heal. And it turns out that the real story, with Mark, Luke, and Matthew dancing around the reality, is that Jesus said he would heal someone and failed to do it. He didn't heal. Mark tries to kosher it up by saying afterwards, and then he went around healing some people. Luke launches a very, very long defense justifying his inability to heal without actually saying that he didn't heal. He cites the prophets. He cites various things. He talks about saying to Jesus, "Doctor, heal yourself," and all sorts of stuff. It's very clear, and if you pay attention to the story, that everybody knows that Jesus failed to heal. John cannot allow that to stand. Jesus can't fail at anything. Jesus is perfect. He's the agent of God. He has all judgment. He can do whatever is necessary to be done at any time for any reason he chooses. So what happens in Luke, in John? In his version of the same story, it's very, very interesting. He eliminates the failure to heal, as the cause of the rejection. And he tells his version of the Eucharist story. And in his version, he says, you have to eat Jesus and you have to drink his blood. Not symbols. He says, eat Jesus and drink his blood. And the people who hear that are astounded. And they start talking about this. And they say, what is he talking about? We know his father. We know his family, his father. How could he be saying this? Are we supposed to actually eat him? They're treating it like cannibalism. And the problem is that it's symbolic. But he's rejected because of this. They can't follow this teaching, this idea of eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And they can't do that. But symbolically, and we get this in passages in other parts of Gospels, eating the bread is the symbol of taking in Jesus's teachings. He's not literally talking about eating bread. He's talking about understand what I'm teaching. So that's what's really going on. But that's the cause of rejection in John's gospel. The people who heard the story about what they have to do to receive salvation, didn't understand it. And he's disappointed in them, and a lot of them abandon him as a result. Now you get the connection between John's story and Paul's story. You now begin to understand what John's revelation, what Paul's revelation. Paul's revelation is a correction to what the disciples were told at the Last Supper. Originally, the disciples were told what Jesus was teaching. You have to eat his flesh and drink his blood. Paul's revelation is that this was symbolism, that you're going to eat bread as a symbol of his flesh, but that's the wrong symbol. And you're going to drink his wine as a symbol of his blood, but that's the wrong symbol. The symbol in John and in the original teaching is you have to take in my teachings. You have to understand what I've taught you. That if you want to go to be saved, you have to take in the fact that I am the one God sent to offer eternal life. So Mark and Luke have left that out of their story and taken Paul's versions as their Eucharist story, because Paul has given them a new revelation about what the story meant.
So you mentioned the Q source a few minutes ago. And in prior discussions, you talked about the possibility that Luke might have used Matthew. What are your current thoughts on that right now?
Okay, I tend to be somewhat neutral, maybe slightly leaning towards Luke making use of Matthew, because I'm convinced to a large extent that Luke found every known source that he could come across, that he explored, he hunted, he examined, and gathered everything he could find about Jesus. And if there was any written source that anybody knew about that he knew about, he would have tried to have a copy made or brought to him or whatever. So it seems to me very logical that he would have had a copy of Matthew. Nevertheless, I'm not convinced that he necessarily used Matthew as the source as opposed to Q. There are differences, and I don't know who has it better. I mean, there's things that are rearranged and so forth. John doesn't deal with Q in any direct way because Q is mostly speech, and John doesn't do speech. But there is one interesting passage in Q that has some bearing on John that gets overlooked because John is accused of being an anti-Jewish gospel. And I'm working on a book to say absolutely not. He's the most pro-Jewish gospel of all, and he wrote part of his gospel to exonerate the Jews. But that's a complicated topic right now. But one of the things they attack him on is for accusing the Jews of having Satan as their father and killing the prophets. And they say that's such a horrible thing. Well, actually, it isn't in context. And in my book, I explain very clearly what the real situation is there. Jesus has been accused himself of working with Satan, and he's merely responding to the accusation in John. But what's going on there is that in Q, the same story the same accusation for the most part is going on. So if it's in Q, and Q is in, and the passage is in Luke and Matthew, why do they say John is more offensive than Luke and Matthew are when they have something equally, if not more offensive than what John has?
Now I'd like to ask you about the resurrection account. What did the resurrection account look like in the Alpha Gospel?
Okay, that's interesting. As you know, Mark's gospel ends in a very abrupt manner for whatever reason. So anything that appears after his ending couldn't have been used by John or Luke, assuming neither of them knew about a special ending of Mark that never got into the gospel as we know it. So what we have is Mark's resurrection gospel ends after Mary goes to the tomb, has her encounter with the tomb, is told about Jesus not being there, races out of the tomb, scared out of her wits, and tells nobody about what happened. She tells nobody. This is contra the John and Luke. And that's where his gospel ends. Luke has a long narrative about what happens after that point. He has Mary Magdalene go to the apostles, tell them Jesus is missing, and they don't believe her. Except, oddly, Peter decides to run over to the tomb and take a look anyhow, even though he didn't believe her. But the reason Luke has that in there is that in the same letter that had the teachings on the Eucharist, Paul says that Peter first ran over and learned about the resurrection before everybody else. So Luke sort of threw that in as a kind of a, let me get right with Paul. But in any event, so we have that story. And then in the meantime, Luke has Jesus wandering towards Emmaus and meeting some disciples, not the apostles, who have apparently lost faith in Jesus. And that's where the story about the resurrection resumes. And in this story, they initially think Jesus is a spirit. So to prove he's not a spirit, he eats bread, and he couldn't eat bread if he was a spirit, and he disappears. He also spent a lot of time giving them a teaching. They're so excited, these disciples, about what happened. They rush back to Jerusalem to tell the apostles what happened. And they tell them, yeah, we heard about that. Peter was there and we looked and blah, 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 blah. Then we get more of the story in Jerusalem about what's going on with the apostles. And so we have two disciples who ran back and met with apostles and spoke to them about the resurrection and had bread with Jesus. And then we have Jesus appearing at the door at Jerusalem, and he comes in the Synoptics, and everybody is astounded. All the apostles are astounded, and they think he's a spirit. And so they have doubts. And he eats fish, and eating fish is proof he's real. And then the story, Jesus leaves, and so on. And the apostles now know. In John, it's my argument that he's taken this same story, which is, I think, in Luke's version, I think, came from the Alpha Gospel, but has changed it significantly. The first thing he did was he replaced the two unfaithful disciples who abandoned Jesus on the road to Emmaus and replaced them at the tomb with Mary Magdalene as the super faithful believer in Jesus. So Jesus appears to a disciple after the tomb, but in John, it's the faithful Mary, and in Luke, it's the two unfaithful disciples who left Jerusalem. But there's no bread, no fish. Mary just wants to run and hug him. She believes it's his human body right in front of her. The whole story, exactly what Jesus wants people to believe. But he tells her not to touch him because the time isn't right yet. Why? I don't know. And then Jesus goes on, and he goes to the house, and he comes in, and again, the disciples are astonished, and Jesus has fish with them, and they know he's and they know he's real. But Thomas, I got that wrong, I'm sorry. They all have doubts at first in Luke, and they have to be persuaded that he's real, and that's when he has the meal with them, and now they know it's real. So that's how, and then Jesus leaves after whatever he does. In John, after meeting with Mary, and he goes to Jerusalem to the house of the disciples, only one disciple is missing, and that's Thomas. The disciples at first were scared, but seemed to accept Jesus for who he is. Only Thomas wasn't there, and he comes later, and only Thomas, and then they tell Thomas what happened, and only Thomas has doubts. And then when Jesus appears to Thomas and offers to let Thomas touch him, Thomas doesn't actually do that. So where all the disciples were doubtful in Luke, only one disciple is doubtful in John, and even he sort of gets it, but not exactly. But John continues the story so far. There's been no eating in John, no fish, no bread. He goes to Galilee. Remember, in Mark's gospel, Mary was told to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. So we have an interesting connection now to Galilee. And John's Jesus goes to Galilee. And when he gets to Galilee, there are two unnamed disciples, kind of parallel to the two disciples that Luke met on the road, that Jesus met on the road to Emmaus, and a few of the apostles. And Jesus names some of the apostles. And he appears, and even now, there's doubts as to who, if it's him or not. And in this one, we have Jesus eating fish and bread after they acknowledge who he is and that he is returned as the bodily Messiah, that he's not a spirit, and he doesn't do the bread and fish until after that happens. So that's how John has reworked everything. I mean, there's a lot more detail than I'm leaving out, but that's how John's version matches Luke's version, but tells a very different version.
What do you make of the great omission in the Gospel of Luke? Things that Luke didn't take in from Mark, like the feeding of the 4,000 or Jesus walking on water, among other things.
Right. Well, Mark apparently had a second source that repeated at least a number of stories in slightly different versions. And he didn't know what to do with it. And he integrated them into his gospel. And that created a lot of editorial problems for him. He had what I claim are 2 bread stories, 2 walking on the water stories, 2 stormy sea stories after the bread, and some other story, 2 versions of healing with spit, Jesus healing with spit. And so there were a lot of parallels in Mark's own gospel, running from 6 to 8 and elsewhere, Mark 6 through Mark 8, and in other places. So you have that, and John and Luke only have 1 bread story, 1 walking on water story. Luke doesn't even have, I don't think Luke has the walking on the water story. John has the crossing of the sea after the storm and a stormy sea, which most gospel scholars tend to ignore as a miracle. I mean, he has a storm. John has the apostles sailing across the water on a sea storm. He gets in the boat and the storm abates. So they don't call it a miracle, but it's a miracle. And Mark has the fullest story earlier in his gospel, where the storm abates after Jesus gives its commands. There are bits of the story moved into Mark. Mark has to try to rewrite those stories so that one of them looks enough different from the other, so as to be different. In the bread stories, he's broken them up. A key problem in the bread stories is that in the bread story, as Mark has it, which he took probably from the proto-gospel, is that Jesus accuses the apostles of not understanding the meaning of the miracle. So he has to make some changes. In the first story, the one that's shared by John and Luke, he doesn't directly accuse them of not understanding the miracle. He thinks it to himself that they don't understand it. It's in the second story in John 8, in Mark 8, that he tells them that they don't understand the miracle. And that's when he accuses them of not understanding in Mark. Otherwise, he would have 2 stories that looked alike and making the same direct accusation, making the apostles look even dimmer than they do here. John doesn't want to have Jesus attacking the apostles. He clears it up at every single stage that Mark has badmouthed them. And instead of having the apostles misunderstand the bread story, he changes it so that when he leaves, the apostles have not made any problems with the bread story. And he goes to Bethsaida, and there were people who followed him to Bethsaida because of the bread miracle. And they all gather around and they ask him for more bread. And John accuses these witnesses to the bread miracle of not understanding it. He says, you only came here because you saw the miracle. You don't know what's going on. There's no attack on the apostles and John for not understanding it. And then he branches out into his other stories. Luke eliminates the walking on water. Luke also makes a big jump from the first bread story all the way past the second bread story, leaving out everything Mark put in between the end of the second bread story and the end of the first bread story. He's taken it all out. No walking on water, no story with spit, and so on. He does move a couple of pieces. He accuses somebody else in a different section of his gospel as to that they don't understand the miracles and such, or that they should reject the bread of Herod. He moves that elsewhere. That's what the apostles didn't understand in Mark. And here's an example of rejecting the bread, where it's really the symbolism of the teaching. And I think Matthew actually goes as far as to say it was the teachings. I think that's what he did.
What do you make of the reference to the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John near the end of the Gospel, suggesting it made suggestions that it's an eyewitness text? Is it perhaps talking about the author of the Alpha Gospel at all?
Well, I don't think he's in the Alpha Gospel. And it's surprising that if he was a witness and was in the Alpha Gospel, that he wouldn't have been incorporated into the other Gospels. I think it's one of my arguments in favor of that Mark and Luke didn't know John, that there's no beloved disciple in their gospel, or certainly nobody known as the beloved disciple. And John has stories about who this fellow is, whether he's actually a witness or not. It's hard to say, and what he was a witness to is hard to say. And whether that was part of his original gospel even is hard to say, because there was some rewriting of his gospel after the fact. After he wrote his gospel, we know that there are some redactions made both in the beginning and in the end of the gospel, and possibly in other places. And changes were made. You see some of those duplicates coming in the story of John the Baptist, where there's some repetition and some duplicate period stories that are altered a bit. So even in John, there are questions about later sources taking his original gospel and making some adjustments. I can't say that the beloved disciple wasn't part of it, but it's very interesting that he removes the beloved disciple from interrogation by saying he died before the gospel was written. And he attacks those who challenge him for allowing him to die before it was written. And he says, who are you to tell me when I should let people receive their salvation?
So do you date the Alpha Gospel not too terribly long after the crucifixion?
Right. I mean, it's not the next day, obviously, but I'm pretty sure it's Paul, pre-Paul. And if we can date Paul's letters to the 50s and assume that the Eucharist story had been making its rounds as it appeared in John, we have some evidence of at least a few years before Paul, that the Alpha Gospel would have been written. There's another piece that I'd get into about earlier sourcing too in a moment. But since Jesus probably died sometime between 30 and 35, 36, and it's possible, I think, that the Alpha Gospel could have been written somewhere between 40 and 45. But I don't think it was written in Galilee or Jerusalem. I think it was written in the diaspora. But I can't be sure of that. I just don't think the author of the Alpha Gospel is familiar enough with Jewish materials to have written in Jerusalem. But there's another area in John's Gospel that also dates it to what I think is a pre-Pauline and pre-Markan date. In the Synoptic Gospels, there are 3 stories about Jesus prophesizing that they have to kill him, that the Jews have to kill him, and that on the 3rd day he'll rise up, and it's necessary for that to happen. John has 3 stories in which Jesus talks about saying he will rise up. He doesn't say he has to be put to death, and he doesn't say anything about the resurrection in the statements. He has 3 statements that he'll rise up, but one was moved out of context, and I do a study in the book of the 3 statements and the one moved out of context, showing that they parallel exactly where in the Synoptic Gospels these 3 rising ups were. And it's even unclear what he means by rising up. And Raymond Brown, in his commentary on the Gospel, believes that this is a much more primitive version of the story appearing in the Synoptic Gospels. So I suspect that these stories too predate Paul, and that Paul is working with later versions of the stories.
What do you make of these saying, destroy this temple and I'll raise it up in 3 days in John? And then in Mark, it's a group of people are quoting Jesus, saying that Jesus said that, but in John, it's quoting Jesus directly, apparently.
Yes, very, very. It's one of my favorite setups. John has done so much work with the problem with the money changers in the temple. He's given it triple function. First, he's moved it away from the Passion account. He's moved it to the beginning of the gospel, practically, to the city of Capernaum, at exactly the point where Mark has Jesus going to Capernaum and performing his first miracle. Let me come back to that as part of the broader story. John also eliminates Mark's claim that as a result of the chasing of the money changers, that they took this as an attack on them and wanted to put Jesus to death. John has eliminated desire to put Jesus to death in his version. He moves it into his story about Jesus's last visit to Jerusalem in a very different context. So what has happened is that in Mark, his first miracle is an exorcism. And as I've told you, John hates exorcisms. So he doesn't want the first miracle to be an exorcism. So he takes two major steps. First, just before Jesus enters Capernaum, where Mark performs the first miracle, he goes to a wedding and changes water into wine. And almost nobody knows that he did it. And he says, hey, this is the first miracle that Jesus did. Then he leaves the wedding, goes to Capernaum, and goes to the temple. So in Mark's story, Jesus went to the synagogue, and John's story, he goes to the temple. John is in Jerusalem. Jesus in Mark, he's in Capernaum, right after. See, that's the weird part, is John has Jesus in Capernaum after the wedding, and then abruptly says Jesus is in Capernaum, and then suddenly moves the story back to Jerusalem. He doesn't tell us anything about what happened in Capernaum, which is very odd, but goes back to Jerusalem. So in John, Jesus is in the temple, and in Mark, Jesus is in the synagogue. In Mark, a man infected by a demon with a corrupted body comes into the synagogue. In John, a corrupted priesthood comes into the temple. In Mark, the corrupted body is healed. In John, the corrupted synagogue is healed. John's story eliminates the exorcism. But when John finishes the story and John goes back to Capernaum, when John goes back to Galilee, he tells us, as a result of what John did in Capernaum in this story, John became famous. Jesus became famous throughout. In Mark, it was the exorcism and the synagogue that made Jesus famous throughout Galilee. In John, it's the chasing of the money changer story that made him famous throughout. So you have these various parallels between John and Mark in their two stories. They're different in look, but they're essentially the same thematic story in which John says, I'm not going to have an exorcism be the first miracle. So there was a second miracle after he gets to Jerusalem, right at the temple. He heals somebody, and that's the first miracle, the second miracle. So in John's gospel, he says, see, the second miracle is healing somebody. And then a lot of the scholars now said very early on, oh, John must have had a book of numbered signs. 1 and 2 are mentioned, and then he dropped the numbers later on, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I say that 1 and 2 are his way of saying, don't believe that the exorcism you heard about in Capernaum was the first miracle. The first miracle was the wine into water, and the second miracle was a healing that didn't depend on an exorcism. Those were the first two miracles, not the one in the proto-gospel. And he had no need to number anything else because that was the purpose of numbering them.
And so did John have the original saying there when it's quoting Jesus directly, or is Mark's version more original?
No, I think John directly quoted. I don't know if he must have directly quoted Jesus. I think what you have is there's another parallel in the story. What's going on? In the temple, they ask Jesus to prove what authority he has to do what he's doing in the temple. And he just basically, they know Jesus is not going to do that. They try to set a trap for him, ask him to do something, and they set a trap for him, and however he answers, he's going to lose. But it's a trap that he's not going to respond to. And so in Mark's version of the story, they set a trap for Jesus that he's not going to fall into. In John, he uses the statement, tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it. He set a trap for them. He knows they're not going to tear down the temple, so he doesn't have to prove what authority he has because they won't take the challenge. In Mark, they set a trap that he didn't have to take, so he didn't have to meet the challenge. In John, he doesn't have to meet the challenge. He uses the statement. But I think it's fairly evident Mark is covering up that there really was a statement. People in Mark are saying there was a statement. Matthew goes so far as to say they're lying about it. Mark seems to know that there really was a statement, but he's trying to say it wasn't true. So I'm fairly convinced that it was in the original gospel. But I think it was part of some story, but I don't know if it was the temple story. I don't know that it was the temple story, the cleansing of the temple.
But one way or another, that would explain why Mark is saying some people quoted Jesus saying it, because the more original quote was in the Alpha Gospel, however it may have looked like.
Exactly.
Let's take some super chats. Hi, Fish and Ty, thank you for your super chat. How early, what year could the Alpha Gospel be?
I would estimate, and it's my suggestion, allowing for time for the stories to be accumulated and to be sufficiently before Paul to know about some of it. My estimate is I would place it between 40 and 45.
Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. How would your proto-gospel compare to reconstructions of Marcion's gospel?
Well, I think Marcion's gospel is very late, and he's working from the sources that he has. I think there's a small group of people who are doing some nice revival work on Marcion, but I just don't think, I think Marcion's just pretty much taking stuff and editing it down from his sources with Luke and Paul and so forth.
Jesus Tales, thank you for another super chat. Since your hypothesis puts this early gospel close to the death of Jesus, do you have any speculation for the author of the proto-gospel?
Well, I can't do that because I think it was written in the diaspora mostly. And it seems that the author, for reasons I can explain, is unfamiliar with what's going on in Jerusalem or with Judaism per se, and has a lot of troubles with that. He might be a Gentile or a God-fearer who was following Judaism but wasn't learned in it. But there are some clues that he's not really that familiar with Jerusalem and Judaism in Judea. And I could go into that a little bit if you'd like.
After these next two super chats, I would like you to. Let's take these next two real quick. Jason Kukulu, thank you for your super chat. Davidic cannibalism inherent in the Eucharist. Is it a Haggadic midrash on Ezekiel, chapter 38, 4-9? In that day you will drink the blood of the warriors and eat the flesh of the rulers.
I don't think so, unless it's a reversal. I mean, in this quote, he's not talking about what's good. He's talking about what will be done to others rather than what they should do to him.
iFish and Ty, thank you for your super sticker. Okay, Gary, could continue with what you were saying a moment ago about the author of the Alpha Gospel.
Okay. First of all, one of the things I point out is the author of the Alpha Gospel doesn't understand the Jewish calendar and has gotten it all wrong. The Jewish calendar was based on a day beginning at night, and the Roman calendar was based on the day beginning at sunrise. So events based on the day of activity would be, if he knew the Jewish calendar, he'd be using the Jewish calendar to describe it. But he's using the Roman calendar to describe events. More specifically, for example, there is he uses, in all the cases where he's using calendar references, he's using them beginning in the morning. More importantly, very tragically for the Gospels and the Jesus resurrection story, he's placing the beginning of the day, the beginning of the Sabbath, at the start of the morning when Mary Magdalene and the other women go to the tomb. That can't be right. The Sabbath either ended either the night before or the night coming up, but not in the morning in between. So that's all wrong. That claiming that Jesus came up, that they found the tomb empty at the beginning of the Sabbath in the morning is an error. That couldn't have been when the Sabbath ended. So they have a problem with when Sabbath ended. Similar, Mark talks about the third bell, I think the third bell and the sixth bell, which was Roman calendars for the 9 a.m. and what we would call 9 a.m. and 12 noon as the beginning of the day. All these, and even John falls for this, which is a problem. But that's because he was using the Alpha Gospel, I suspect. So we have this terminology. Also, in the Alpha Gospel, the author, in the regular Gospel, all the four Gospels talk about the day of preparation, that this happened on the day of preparation. There is no such term as the day of preparation in the Jewish calendar or in Judaism, because the day begins at sunset. So in the Jewish idiom, the day of preparation for Passover wouldn't exist. It would be the day before Passover is the evening of Passover, meaning the coming evening is when Passover starts. The only place day of preparation ever appears anywhere is basically in the four Gospels. Nobody else uses that. It doesn't appear in later literature, I don't think. I didn't find it anywhere. I didn't do a thorough search. It's certainly not anything Jews would say, and it's not how Jews would have celebrated it at that time. So the author doesn't know the term evening of preparation. He's speculating on it. There also are attempts, you find a lot of trying to explain Jewish terms to an audience, which to me is a sign of not being from Judaism. He's talking to a non-Jewish audience. So for these various reasons, among others, I don't think the Alpha Gospel author was from Galilee or Jerusalem. I think he was in the diaspora. And in the diaspora, they were largely speaking Aramaic or Greek or Latin.
All right, let's take a look at this diagram. Would this be a fair or close to fair representation of what you're saying? Mark and Luke and John using the Alpha Gospel. John not depending on the Synoptics.
Right.
Luke possibly using Matthew. I know you're... I don't have Q in this particular diagram, but
right.
Either Luke used Matthew, possibly Q, one way or the other.
Well, yeah, it's reasonable as long as you don't take those as the only sources that went into the Gospels. I mean, mine is mostly about the biographical material. You know, I don't do the speeches. I don't do things like that. So there might be speech material that John picked up from somewhere else besides the Alpha Gospel. And there are some places in John that have been edited by redactors that didn't come from the Alpha Gospel. But broadly speaking, that's accurate.
This diagram.
Yeah, reasonably accurate.
Those redactions in John that you're speaking on, were those redactions additions to John that came from the Synoptics? Did those redactors know about the Synoptics or not at all?
No, there's a lot of duplication in the story of John the Baptist. Repetitious stuff that's been multiplied. You can see the editing taking place when you look at what's put in and taken out. John is starting with a very real story, I think. I don't know if his is the original. I don't know if the opening part of John 1 is the original or the redaction. But we have two different versions going on with who John the Baptist is. And it's apparent that a lot of people were thinking he was the Messiah and a competitor to Jesus. And because we have Luke and John both saying that the people were thinking that the Baptist might be the Messiah, and they're asking him about it. And both have the Baptist avoiding that answer, saying, no, there's someone else coming. But one part of John says that he was sent down from heaven by the Father, and he was a witness. He was the Word, which was truth, and that John was created in the early period of creation as a witness to the truth. But it's not always clear that John is witnessing, and even that the Baptist is witnessing even in John. There are two different versions of what he's doing. And I think, so part of that opening point about the Word might be from the redactors.
Why do you think that Matthew did not know the Alpha Gospel?
I don't say in principle that Matthew didn't know the Alpha Gospel. My position is I don't know enough about Matthew. For me to find Matthew knew something about the Alpha Gospel, I'd have to find a large number of incidents in Matthew that agree with John against Mark. And I don't see that. That's not to say he choose not to use very much of it at all. He may have known the Alpha Gospel, but I can't find enough material in his gospel that matches John against Mark to find that to be the case. So I'm not saying he didn't know it. I'm just saying I don't have proof that he did know it.
You mentioned earlier that there are other sources. You mentioned that Mark had another source besides the Alpha Gospel.
Yes.
And there's also the possibility that there may have been a Q source. So how many sources do you currently suspect are out there influencing these Gospels that are not in this diagram?
Oh, wow. I think Luke says there's a lot of writings floating around. Certainly parts of Paul's letters are heavily influencing the Gospels, or at least the Synoptic Gospels, like the Eucharist, for example. There are a lot of oral traditions, alleged memories. There are people who may have been witnesses who are telling stories that have been passed on to others. So it's kind of a little hard to identify all of them, other than I'm fairly certain that Luke did everything he could to find everything he knew about. I think he was the one most aggressive about collecting sources. And then Paul's letters became heavily collected.
I remember in the book you talked about the possibility that there may be eventually a critical edition of the Alpha Gospel that may be produced. Is that still a possibility that they may eventually happen?
I don't anticipate personally doing a critical edition of the Alpha Gospel. The critical edition would have to be the product of some acceptance, more acceptance in the mainstream, such that scholars are starting to look at it more seriously, paying more attention to the issues and the problems, what makes more sense or what they have questions about. And I don't think we could get to a critical edition until there's more serious scholarly discussion in the literature. I've been reviewed in a few academic publications, and hopefully down the line that's going to help trigger these things. But scholarship works slowly in things like academia, and it frequently takes a lot of years for something to circulate. There's no rush to eliminate paradigms. A lot of people have spent their lives studying and having a certain set of beliefs. They're not going to abandon them now. But new generations will come along. They aren't necessarily committed. If they learn about something like the Alpha Gospel early, they're going to be curious. They're going to explore it. And we'll see things developing. There's some work right now going on. A few scholars are now trying to find connections between John and Matthew on a verbal level. And a couple of papers have been presented at conferences at SBL on that.
Are you eventually going to have some more material coming out on the Alpha Gospel at all?
I'm working on another book based on what I did in the Alpha Gospel, which takes the Alpha Gospel as its starting point in large amount, but which is not about the Alpha Gospel per se. In the Alpha Gospel, I point out that John has rewritten the plot of the Passion account. But it wasn't the focus of what I was writing in the Alpha Gospel story. But I am going to take his rewriting, all the things he did to challenge the Synoptic Gospels, and all the anti-Jewish stuff in the Synoptic Gospels, and show his attack on anti-Judaism in the Synoptic Gospels. So I'm going to be taking the material I did in the Alpha Gospel and other parts of the Alpha Gospel and working it into a different thematic story. So we'll have another variation based on the Alpha Gospel, based on a serious study that I think a lot of people are going to be very, very curious about.
So I just want to remind everybody real quick that I have the link to purchase the case for a proto-gospel in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Gary Greenberg.
Okay.
We do have one more super chat that got snuck in here right before I hit the end stream button. So we'll take it real quick. Fish and Tie, thank you for another super chat. If disciple Matthew were a tax collector, does that mean he was literate and could have written a gospel in the 30s?
Well, it's certainly possible, except if you're assuming that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, he seems to be putting Matthew in the third person, which seems rather strange. So I don't say that he couldn't have, but I would suspect that he was, if he was a tax collector, it's a question of whether he was a soldier collecting it on behalf of an official, or if he was an official who was appointed to keep track. And I'm not sure that's clear, but I'm willing to grant that a tax collector might have had some degree of literacy. Certainly enough to do some counting and record keeping.
All right, I'm going to close out. Again, thank you for joining me, Gary.
You're welcome.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.